He thought humiliating her would be effortless, but he had no idea he was mocking the very woman who would soon hold his fate in her hands. The courtroom in downtown Chicago carried its usual rhythm that morning. The low murmur of attorneys exchanging last-minute arguments, the soft shuffle of polished shoes across marble floors, the quiet authority that came from decades of unquestioned hierarchy. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long golden lines across rows of wooden benches filled with observers who had come to witness another ordinary proceeding. Another predictable outcome, another reminder that power always seemed to sit on one side of the room. And then she walked in. Evelyn Carter moved without hurry, her steps measured, her presence almost invisible against the backdrop of tailored suits and expensive briefcases. She wore a simple navy dress, modest heels, nothing that demanded attention, nothing that signaled status. And yet there was something about the way she paused just inside the doorway, her eyes scanning the room with quiet precision, as if she were not entering unfamiliar territory, but returning to something she already understood far too well. No one noticed that detail. Of course, they noticed only what they expected to see. A middle-aged woman, understated, unremarkable, clearly out of place. A junior clerk glanced at her briefly before looking away, already dismissing her as someone who had wandered into the wrong room. A pair of attorneys near the front exchanged subtle smirks, their voices dropping just enough to keep their commentary from becoming official, but not enough to hide the intent behind it. Another lost spectator, one muttered under his breath, adjusting his cufflinks as though the gesture itself reinforced his authority. Evelyn didn't respond. She simply took a seat along the side, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, as if the quiet underestimation settling around her was something she had encountered countless times before and no longer found worth correcting. At the center of it all stood Judge Harold Whitaker, a man whose reputation filled the room before he even spoke, known for his sharp tongue, his intolerance for what he considered incompetence, and his unmistakable belief that authority was something to be displayed, not questioned. He adjusted his robe with practiced precision, glancing over the docket with a faint impatience that suggested he had already decided how the morning would unfold, his voice carrying the weight of finality as he called the session to order. The room straightened instantly, conversations dissolving into silence, attention snapping forward. And yet, even in that shift, Evelyn remained exactly as she was, composed, observant, almost detached from the performance of control unfolding around her. She watched as the first case was introduced, as arguments were presented with rehearsed confidence, as interruptions came swift and sharp from the bench, each one reinforcing the unspoken hierarchy that defined the space. And then, almost casually, almost as if searching for something to break the monotony, Judge Whitaker's gaze drifted toward the side rows where Evelyn sat, lingering just long enough for curiosity to turn into scrutiny, and scrutiny to turn into something else entirely. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing with the faintest trace of amusement, as though he had just found something, someone, unexpected enough to entertain him. "You there," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the room, drawing every eye in the direction of the woman who had not intended to be seen. "Are you aware this is an active courtroom?" The question hung in the air, light on the surface, heavy underneath, and for the first time, the room's attention shifted fully onto Evelyn Carter, not with interest, but with anticipation, the kind that comes when people believe they are about to witness someone being put in their place. She looked up slowly, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and for a brief moment, something in the room seemed to hesitate, as if it sensed a miscalculation no one had yet understood. But the moment passed, swallowed by expectation, by assumption, by the quiet certainty that whatever happened next would follow the same familiar script. The room leaned in, waiting, and Evelyn simply met his gaze without a word. The faintest ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom, subtle but unmistakable, as if the room itself had already decided how this moment would end, and Judge Whitaker allowed it, his lips curling slightly with the kind of confidence that came from never having his authority questioned. He leaned forward just enough to make his presence feel heavier, his voice lowering into something sharper, more deliberate. "I asked you a question," he repeated, each word measured. each syllable designed to remind her where she stood in the hierarchy of that room, or at least where he believed she stood. Evelyn did not rush to answer. She rose slowly instead, smoothing the front of her dress with a calm that felt almost out of place against the tightening tension around her, and for a brief second, the room hesitated again, uncertain why her composure felt so steady, so unaffected by the attention pressing down on her. "Yes, Your Honor," she said at last, her voice even, respectful, but not diminished, not uncertain, simply present in a way that did not match what the room had expected. That alone drew a few raised eyebrows, a few exchanged glances between attorneys who had anticipated nervousness, hesitation, something easier to dismiss. Judge Whitaker noticed it too, and something in his expression shifted, not enough for most to catch, but enough to sharpen his tone further. "Then you should also be aware that this is not a place for spectators to wander in and interrupt proceedings," he continued, his words carrying just enough volume to ensure the entire room absorbed them. "Unless, of course, you believe you have something relevant to contribute." A few quiet chuckles followed, restrained but encouraged, and the clerk at the side table lowered his eyes quickly, already sensing where this was going. Evelyn held his gaze without flinching, her hands resting lightly at her sides, and when she spoke again, her words came with quiet precision. "I would never presume to interrupt, Your Honor," she said, her tone unchanged, "but I believe there may be a procedural inconsistency in the argument that was just presented." The room shifted instantly, the air tightening as if someone had drawn an invisible line no one expected her to cross, and the attorneys near the front straightened, their earlier amusement turning into something closer to irritation. Judge Whitaker's expression hardened, the faint smile disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. "A procedural inconsistency," he repeated, the phrase sounding almost absurd coming from her, and he leaned back in his chair, studying her now with open skepticism. "And you are?" he asked, not out of curiosity, but as a setup, a step in a sequence he had performed many times before. Evelyn paused, just long enough to let the silence stretch, just long enough for the room to lean in again, waiting for her answer, waiting for the moment where she would confirm exactly what they all assumed. "Evelyn Carter," she replied simply. No title, no explanation, just a name. It was not the answer they wanted. It was not the answer he expected. And for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Judge Whitaker's face, something almost imperceptible, before it was buried beneath the weight of his authority again. "Miss Carter," he said, placing deliberate emphasis on the formality. "This courtroom operates on years of legal training and experience. It is not a forum for unsolicited observations from the gallery." The words landed exactly as intended, drawing another wave of restrained laughter, louder this time, more confident, and somewhere in the back, a man shook his head as if the outcome had already been decided. Evelyn did not react to any of it. She did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not retreat. She simply nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something far deeper than the dismissal itself. "Of course," she said quietly, and then she fell silent. The room relaxed almost immediately, tension dissolving into satisfaction, into the comfortable belief that order had been restored, that the interruption had been handled, that everything would continue exactly as expected. But Judge Whitaker did not look away from her. Not yet, because something about that silence did not feel like defeat. It felt like patience. The courtroom moved on, as if nothing had happened, as if the brief interruption had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience quickly corrected, and yet something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, something that did not quite settle back into place. Attorneys resumed their arguments, voices steady but edged with a faint urgency, as though they were unconsciously aware that the rhythm had been disrupted, even if they could not explain why. Judge Whitaker adjusted the papers in front of him with deliberate precision, reasserting control through routine, through authority, through the familiar cadence of rulings and objections that had always bent to his command. And yet his gaze drifted more often than it should have toward the side of the room, where Evelyn stood, still composed, still silent, still watching. It bothered him in a way he could not name. The next case proceeded with increasing complexity, a contractual dispute layered with technical arguments that stretched across months of documentation, and one of the attorneys, a confident man in a charcoal suit, stepped forward with a tone that bordered on theatrical certainty as he presented a key point, citing precedent and procedural framing designed to close the argument decisively. The room leaned into his confidence. Nods exchanged. Pens paused mid-note. The sense that this was the moment where the outcome would become inevitable. And then, almost imperceptibly, Evelyn tilted her head. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it carried the weight of recognition, as if something in the argument had aligned incorrectly in her mind, like a note slightly off in an otherwise perfect composition. She did not speak. Not yet. Instead, her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the bench beside her, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but her eyes sharper now, focused with a clarity that suggested she was no longer simply observing but analyzing, dissecting, reconstructing the logic unfolding in front of her. The attorney continued, building momentum, layering complexity upon complexity, until Judge Whitaker nodded once, a signal that he was prepared to move toward conclusion, his voice beginning to form the words that would bring the matter to a close. And then Evelyn spoke. "Your Honor," she said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a precision that cut cleanly through the room, stopping the words before they could fully form. The reaction was immediate, sharper this time, less amused and more irritated, as though the room had grown tired of her presence interrupting its order, and the attorney turned toward her with open frustration, his expression no longer concealed behind professionalism. Judge Whitaker's patience thinned visibly, his jaw tightening as he leaned forward again, authority returning to his voice with unmistakable force. "Miss Carter," he said, the warning clear beneath the formality, "you have already been advised." But she did not step back. She did not hesitate. The precedent he cited, she continued, her tone steady, her words measured, was overturned in the appellate decision 3 years ago, specifically due to the procedural framework being misapplied in cases with layered contractual amendments. The room froze. Not completely, not immediately, but in fragments, like a chain reaction that moved from one person to another, from confusion to realization, from dismissal to uncertainty. The attorney blinked, just once, his confidence faltering as his mind raced to verify what she had just said, and for the first time, he did not respond right away. Papers shifted. A clerk glanced down at a screen. Another attorney leaned forward slightly, brows drawing together. Judge Whitaker's expression did not change, not outwardly, but something beneath it tightened, something that had not been there before. "That is not accurate," the attorney said finally, though his voice carried less certainty than before, and he reached for his notes with a quickness that betrayed the crack in his composure. Evelyn did not argue further. She did not press the point. She simply watched, her silence returning as deliberately as her words had arrived, and within seconds, the room began to realize what had just happened. The attorney's page flipped once, then again, his movements growing sharper, less controlled, until his eyes stopped, fixed on a line that had been overlooked, a detail that had been missed, a flaw that should not have been there. The room did not laugh this time. It did not react with amusement or dismissal. It waited. And in that waiting, something shifted again, deeper now, heavier, as the certainty that had filled the courtroom just minutes ago began to dissolve into something far less comfortable. Doubt. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, as the attorney's confidence unraveled in real time, his fingers moving faster now, flipping through pages that no longer felt like solid ground beneath him, and every second that passed without a clear rebuttal deepened the shift that had begun to take hold of the room. The certainty that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that settled into every corner of the courtroom. Judge Whitaker did not interrupt immediately, but his posture changed, the slight lean forward, the narrowing of his eyes, the way his hand hovered just above the bench as though deciding whether to restore control or observe what was unfolding. And for the first time that morning, hesitation entered the space where authority had once been absolute. "Counselor," he said finally, his voice steady but edged with something sharper, "can you address the point raised?" The words were neutral, procedural, but the implication beneath them was not. The room felt it, the subtle shift of weight from assumption to verification, from confidence to scrutiny. The attorney cleared his throat, straightening his jacket as if the gesture could rebuild what had already begun to slip. But when he spoke, his tone no longer carried the same conviction. "Your Honor, the precedent remains applicable under," he began, only to stop mid-sentence as his eyes returned to the line he had just found, the one detail he could not ignore, the one inconsistency that had quietly undermined his entire argument. The pause lingered longer this time, long enough for whispers to almost form before being swallowed by the tension pressing down on the room. Evelyn did not move. She did not look around to measure the reaction. She simply stood where she was, her expression calm, her gaze steady, as though she had already moved beyond the moment that now held everyone else in place. It was not defiance. It was not triumph. It was something quieter, something far more controlled. Judge Whittaker noticed it, and something in his expression hardened again, not out of certainty, but out of resistance, the kind that comes when control begins to slip in ways that cannot be easily corrected. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness with renewed force. "This court does not operate on speculative observations from the gallery, regardless of how they may appear in isolation." The words were meant to reclaim ground, to re-establish the hierarchy that had been momentarily disturbed, and a few heads nodded instinctively, eager to return to familiar order. But the effect did not fully land. Not this time, because the doubt had already taken root. The attorney shifted again, more visibly now, his hand tightening around his notes as he searched for a way to reframe the argument, to close the gap that had been exposed. But every path he considered seemed to circle back to the same problem, the same overlooked detail that could not be ignored. A clerk at the side table leaned closer to the screen in front of him, typing quickly, cross-referencing, verifying. And when he finally looked up, his expression had changed in a way that was impossible to hide. Judge Whittaker saw it. He saw all of it. And for a brief moment, the room held its breath, waiting for the ruling that would either dismiss the disruption or acknowledge it. Evelyn remained silent, not because she had nothing more to say, but because she understood something the rest of the room did not yet fully grasp. This was no longer about proving a point. The point had already been made. This was about what would happen next. Judge Whittaker exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, but in that breath was a decision forming, a shift that could not be undone once spoken. He glanced once more toward Evelyn, and this time, his gaze lingered longer than before, not with amusement, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, though he would not name it, not yet. "Proceed," he said at last, turning back to the attorney, but the word carried less authority than it had earlier, less certainty, as if the room itself no longer fully belonged to him. And in that subtle imbalance, something else began to emerge, something deeper than doubt, something that had not yet revealed itself, but was already shaping the outcome in ways no one had anticipated. The room was no longer just watching a case unfold. It was waiting for something else entirely. The shift in the room did not reverse. It deepened, settling into the space like a weight no one could quite shake off. And as the proceedings attempted to continue, the rhythm that once felt controlled now carried an undercurrent of unease. Each word spoken measured more carefully, each argument delivered with less certainty than before. The attorney, once confident, now chose his words with visible caution, avoiding the very line of reasoning he had defended moments ago, and that avoidance did not go unnoticed. Judge Whittaker observed everything, his expression composed, but his attention no longer divided between the case and the performance of authority. It was focused now, sharpened by something he could not dismiss, something that had introduced a crack into the certainty he had relied on for years. And still, Evelyn remained exactly where she was, silent, composed, her presence no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, but not yet understood. The clerk at the side table leaned toward the bench, whispering something too low for the room to hear, but the effect was immediate. Judge Whittaker's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes flickering for just a fraction of a second before returning to the attorney in front of him. "We will take a brief pause," he announced, his voice controlled, though it carried a firmness that suggested the decision had not been part of the original plan, and the gavel struck lightly, not as a command, but as a transition. The room exhaled collectively, tension releasing into murmurs that filled the space almost instantly. Conversations beginning in hushed tones, questions forming, assumptions unraveling. Some turned to look at Evelyn openly now, no longer pretending indifference, their expressions shifting between curiosity and quiet disbelief, as though trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they thought they understood. She did not engage. She did not acknowledge the attention. Instead, she remained still, her gaze lowered slightly, not in submission, but in thought, as if the moment unfolding around her was only a small part of a much larger picture she had already seen. Near the front, the attorney conferred quickly with his colleague, voices urgent, gestures sharper than before, while another clerk moved briskly toward the back of the room, carrying a file that had not been part of the morning's proceedings, its presence subtle but significant to those paying close attention. Judge Whitaker stepped down briefly from the bench, speaking in low tones with the court administrator, his posture rigid, his movements controlled, but the tension in his shoulders betraying something deeper, something closer to realization than he was willing to admit. The minutes stretched, not long enough to disrupt the schedule, but long enough to change the atmosphere entirely, and when he returned to his seat, the room fell silent again, not out of routine this time, but out of expectation. His gaze swept across the courtroom once more, slower now, more deliberate, until it stopped where it had before. On her. "Miss Carter," he said, the formality still present, but the tone no longer carried the same edge of dismissal. There was something else beneath it now, something closer to caution. "You seem to possess a familiarity with legal procedure that extends beyond casual observation." It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement carefully disguised as one. Evelyn lifted her eyes to meet his, steady as ever, and for a moment, the room held its breath again, waiting for the answer that would either confirm their assumptions or dismantle them completely. She did not rush. She did not fill the silence unnecessarily. She simply stood there, composed, as if the weight of the room's attention meant nothing at all. "I have had some experience," she replied quietly. The understatement did not land the way she intended it to. Or perhaps it landed exactly as she intended, because the reaction it triggered was immediate, sharper than before, not laughter this time, but a deeper, more unsettled kind of disbelief. Judge Whitaker studied her more closely now, not as an interruption, not as a distraction, but as something he had misjudged, and that realization, though still unspoken, had already begun to reshape the balance of the room. The authority that once felt absolute was no longer unquestioned, and the silence that followed her words was no longer empty. It was waiting. The silence after her words did not feel like confusion anymore. It felt like calculation, like a room full of people quietly reevaluating everything they thought they understood, and Judge Whitaker was no exception, though he would never allow it to show too openly. He leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on Evelyn Carter with a level of attention he had not given her before. Not when she first walked in, not when he dismissed her, not even when she corrected the attorney, but now there was no dismissal left, only scrutiny, careful and deliberate. "Some experience," he repeated, slower this time, as though testing the weight of her words, and the faintest hint of skepticism returned, not as arrogance, but as resistance to something he could not yet fully accept. Around the room, the murmurs had faded again, replaced by a focused stillness, every movement quieter, every breath more controlled, as if no one wanted to be the one to break whatever was building beneath the surface. The court administrator stepped closer to the bench, placing a thin folder beside the judge with a subtle motion that did not draw attention from most, but Evelyn noticed it immediately, her eyes flicking briefly toward the document before returning to stillness. And in that small, almost invisible moment, something shifted again, something that felt less like uncertainty and more like inevitability. Judge Whitaker opened the folder without ceremony, his expression unchanged at first, but as his eyes moved across the page, the composure he had maintained so carefully began to fracture, not dramatically, not enough for the untrained eye to catch, but in the tightening of his jaw, in the slight pause between one breath and the next, in the way his fingers pressed just a bit harder against the paper than before. He looked up slowly, his gaze finding Evelyn again, and this time there was no trace of amusement, no trace of dismissal, only a quiet, controlled recognition that settled heavily into the space between them. "Miss Carter," he said, and the room heard it. The difference in his voice, the shift from authority to something closer to formality, to caution. "Would you care to clarify the extent of your experience for the court?" It was no longer a challenge. It was an invitation, the one he did not fully intend to offer. Evelyn did not move immediately, allowing the question to settle, allowing the room to lean in once more. But this time the anticipation was different, no longer rooted in expectation of failure, but in the possibility of revelation. She took a single step forward, measured, unhurried, her posture unchanged, her presence now undeniable, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision it always had. "I believe the clarification you are looking for is already in your hand, Your Honor," she said quietly. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. Judge Whitaker's eyes dropped back to the folder, scanning it again, more carefully this time, and the realization that followed did not come all at once. It unfolded in stages, each line reinforcing what the previous had suggested, each detail dismantling the assumption he had made from the moment she entered the room. Around them, the silence deepened, no one speaking, no one moving, as if the entire courtroom had instinctively understood that something irreversible was happening. The clerk who had delivered the folder stepped back slowly, his expression neutral but his posture tense, while the attorneys near the front exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence replaced by something far less comfortable. Evelyn remained where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, her eyes steady, her presence unwavering, as though she had been standing in that position all along, waiting not for recognition, but for the moment when the truth would no longer be avoidable. Judge Whitaker closed the folder with deliberate care, his movements slower now, more controlled, but the authority in them had changed, no longer unquestioned, no longer absolute, and when he looked up again, the room could see it clearly. Something had shifted, not just in him, but in the entire courtroom. And whatever came next would not follow the script they had expected. The weight of the moment settled fully now, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but undeniable, and the courtroom that had once been filled with quiet arrogance now held something entirely different, something closer to realization, though not everyone was ready to accept it. Judge Whitaker remained still for a brief second longer, the folder closed in front of him, his hand resting on it, as if it carried more than just paper, as if it carried the consequence of every assumption made in that room since the moment Evelyn Carter had walked through the door. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, but the authority within it had shifted, refined into something more cautious, more deliberate. "Court will stand in recess," he said, the words landing with a finality that no one questioned this time, and the gavel followed, sharper than before, echoing against the high ceiling and polished wood as if marking the end of something far larger than a single proceeding. But no one moved immediately. They did not rush to gather their things, did not lean into conversation, did not return to the comfortable noise that had filled the room earlier. Instead, they waited, because something unfinished lingered in the air, something that had not yet fully revealed itself. The bailiff stepped forward from the side of the room, his posture suddenly more formal, more precise, and his voice, when it came, carried a clarity that cut through the stillness with unmistakable purpose. "All rise," he announced, louder now, not as routine, but as declaration. The room obeyed instinctively, chairs sliding back, bodies rising in near-perfect unison, the sound filling the space like a wave, but confusion flickered across several faces, subtle at first, then growing, because the timing was wrong, the sequence unfamiliar, and Judge Whitaker had not yet stood. He did not move. His gaze remained fixed forward, not commanding, not leading, but waiting. And then the second part came. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Carter presiding. The bailiff continued, his voice unwavering, each word landing with precise weight, and for a moment, the room did not react. It did not process. It simply held the words in suspended disbelief, as if reality itself had paused to catch up. Then it happened all at once. Heads turned, eyes widened. The attorney who had stood so confidently just minutes before froze completely, his hand still gripping the edge of his notes, as though movement itself had become impossible. The clerk at the side table stopped mid-motion, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. Even the court administrator stepped back slightly, as if the space itself needed to adjust. And at the center of it all, Evelyn Carter moved. Not quickly, not dramatically. She simply took a step forward, then another, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her presence now fully revealed for what it had always been. The quiet woman in the simple navy dress was no longer standing at the side of the room. She was walking toward the bench. The same bench where she had been questioned, dismissed, corrected. The same space that had been used to measure her worth just moments before. Judge Whitaker remained seated as she approached, his face composed but no longer in control of the room, not in the way he had been before, and when she reached the front, there was a brief pause, a single moment where everything aligned, where the past few minutes collapsed into a single realization that none of them could ignore. Then he stood, slowly, not out of habit, not out of performance, but out of recognition. The shift was complete. Evelyn stepped behind the bench, her hand resting lightly against its surface for a fraction of a second before she took her place. And as she looked out over the courtroom, her gaze steady, her presence undeniable, the silence that followed was absolute. Not forced, not commanded, earned. No one laughed now. No one whispered. No one questioned. Because in that moment, the truth did not need to be explained. It had already rewritten everything. No one moved until she did. The air itself seemed to wait, suspended between disbelief and realization, as Evelyn Carter settled into the judge's chair with a quiet authority that did not need to be announced twice. Her hands rested lightly on the bench, not gripping, not asserting, simply present, and when she lifted her gaze across the courtroom, it carried a steadiness that replaced every ounce of uncertainty that had filled the room just minutes before. The transformation was not loud. It was absolute. Judge Whitaker remained standing for a brief moment longer than necessary, his posture rigid, his expression carefully controlled, but the shift in position was undeniable. He was no longer at the center, no longer the voice that defined the room, and the recognition of that change settled heavily in the silence around him. Slowly, he stepped back, yielding the space without resistance, because resistance would have required denial, and denial was no longer possible. Evelyn did not acknowledge the transition directly. She did not look at him, did not address the moment, because she did not need to. The room had already seen it. "You may be seated," she said, her voice calm, measured, and for the first time since the morning began, the command did not carry tension or performance. It carried clarity. Chairs moved in unison, the sound softer now, almost careful, as though no one wanted to disrupt the gravity of what had just unfolded. The attorney at the front adjusted his stance, his earlier confidence replaced by a precise, controlled stillness, his eyes avoiding direct contact for a moment longer than usual, recalibrating, reassessing, understanding that the rules had not changed, but the person enforcing them had. Evelyn glanced briefly at the case file in front of her, flipping one page with deliberate ease, her familiarity with the material evident not through display, but through the absence of hesitation. "Counselor," she said, her gaze lifting again, "you may proceed with your argument, but I expect it to reflect the correct appellate framework referenced earlier." The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. Their precision alone was enough. The attorney nodded quickly, his voice returning, but stripped of the certainty it once carried, replaced by careful articulation, each word chosen with an awareness that had not been there before. Across the room, the observers remained silent, their attention fixed, not out of obligation, but out of genuine focus now, as though they were witnessing something that extended beyond a single case, something that redefined the balance they had taken for granted. Judge Whitaker stood off to the side, no longer seated, no longer speaking, his presence still visible, but no longer dominant, and for the first time, he was the one observing, the one learning, the one recalculating everything that had led to this moment. Evelyn continued, her control of the room effortless, not imposed, not forced, but earned through the very restraint she had shown when she had every reason to respond differently. She did not revisit the earlier exchange. She did not highlight the mistake, did not call attention to the dismissal she had endured. Instead, she moved forward, guiding the proceedings with quiet authority, correcting where necessary, allowing space where appropriate. And in doing so, she established something far more powerful than a reaction. She established presence. The room responded accordingly, every movement more measured, every voice more deliberate, because the lesson had already been delivered without a single word needing to explain it. And as the case unfolded under her direction, one truth settled deeper than any argument presented that day. Authority, when real, does not need to prove itself. It reveals itself at the moment it is no longer questioned. And in that courtroom, in that silence, everyone understood exactly what that looked like. The courtroom did not return to what it had been before, not even as the final arguments were presented and the case moved steadily toward its conclusion, because something far more permanent had already taken place, something that could not be undone by routine or reset by procedure. Every voice that spoke now carried a quiet awareness, every movement measured against a standard that had just been redefined without announcement. Evelyn Carter listened without interruption, her attention precise, her presence unwavering, and when the final statement was delivered, she allowed a brief silence to settle, not as hesitation, but as intention, giving the weight of the moment the space it required before she spoke. "The court has reviewed the arguments and the applicable precedent," she said, her tone even, her words clear, and in that clarity there was no room for doubt, no trace of uncertainty, only resolution. She delivered the ruling with quiet authority, each point structured, each conclusion grounded, not rushed, not extended, but exact, and as her words filled the room, the outcome felt less like a decision and more like the inevitable result of something that had already been understood long before it was spoken aloud. When she finished, there was no immediate reaction, no shifting of papers, no whisper of conversation, only stillness, as if the room itself needed a moment to absorb not just the ruling, but everything that had led to it. Then, slowly, movement returned. The attorneys gathered their materials with care, no longer hurried, no longer confident in the same way, but respectful, deliberate. The clerk resumed his work with renewed focus. Even the observers rose more quietly than before, their conversations subdued, their expressions thoughtful, as though they were leaving with more than they had come to witness. At the side of the room, Judge Whitaker remained where he stood, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by the authority he had carried earlier, but by something else, something quieter, something closer to reflection. He watched as the room adjusted around a reality he had not anticipated, and though he did not speak, the absence of words carried its own weight. Evelyn did not look toward him as she organized the documents on the bench, her movements calm, unhurried, because acknowledgement was not required, and explanation was unnecessary. The lesson had already been delivered, not through confrontation, not through correction, but through presence, through restraint, through the simple act of allowing the truth to reveal itself at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. As the courtroom gradually emptied, the echo of footsteps soft against the marble floor, the light from the tall windows shifting slightly as the morning moved forward, one thing remained, settling into the space long after the people had gone. Respect. Not the kind demanded by position or enforced by title, but the kind earned in silence, in patience, in the moment when assumptions fall away and reality stands without defense. And for those who had been there, who had watched it unfold from dismissal to realization, from certainty to humility, that moment would not fade easily. Because on that day, in that courtroom, they had not just witnessed authority change hands. They had witnessed what it truly looked like when dignity refused to announce itself, and instead waited, quietly, until the world was ready to see it.